Thank you, Vittorio, for your kind words et merci aux interprètes pour votre travail précieux. Je vais maintenant
Thank you. I would like to extend my greetings to all interpreters for their work. I'm going to share my screen.
just tell me if you can see the PowerPoint.
Can you see the presentation? Okay, let's get it started. Among the situations of great fragility we discussed today, elderly people living with neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's, are certainly among the most fragile of all. When cognitive abilities are impaired, when memory crumbles, sometimes to the point of no longer knowing exactly who one is, humans become extremely vulnerable and dependent on those around them. So, how can this particular fragility be considered a bridge to heaven? In these situations of extreme vulnerability, does something truly allow us to see a bridge to heaven? To create a bridge, to cross, where we can be cautious and attentive, but with preparation. So please follow me through this bridge, especially for people suffering neurodegenerative diseases. My speech will be divided in three parts: preparing our crossing on the bridge. So we'll be talking about dementia. Second, crossing the bridge. Alongside medical care, we need to take into account the spiritual dimension of people living with neurodegenerative diseases, as well as their loved ones and caregivers. And the third point, going further, a few challenges for communities of believers. First point, speaking about Alzheimer's before stepping onto the rope bridge. Alzheimer's disease is part of what we call dementias, which are neurodegenerative diseases that alter cognitive functions, behavior, and the functioning of memory. Today, Alzheimer's disease is the most common neurodegenerative disease, accounting for about 60% of cases. Each second, we have a huge amount of people developing neurodegenerative diseases, and according to current estimates, some 57 million people are living with dementia worldwide. So, before we begin preparing to journey with people living with dementia, we must realize that our words matter. The way we speak about the disease to those affected, patients, loved ones, caregivers, impacts how these individuals perceive themselves and even affects their quality of life. The disease is frightening because people see only the negative. The dominant image used when speaking about Alzheimer's is that of a disease of loss of faculties, loss of memory. On this subject, the French author Colette Rumanoff wrote, "The human brain does not like to lose. We need to overhaul the marketing of this pathology. Any advertiser will tell you, with a brand image like that, it's unsellable. This is why I prefer to speak of alterations or modifications. Indeed, people living with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's never lose the ability to express themselves. It is true that As the disease progresses, their verbal vocabulary shrinks. This reduction is a source of frustration for both the patient and those around them. But loss and reduction are not the same thing. When something is lost, it has vanished. But when we light a tiny flame in the dark, everything changes. So, viewing the whole person purely in terms of loss is equivalent to blowing out the flame and locking the person away in darkness. The way we speak about patients impacts their quality of life. This applies to media, the medical world, civil society, but it also applies within the church. Linguists, such as Baldwin von Gorp, call this entirely negative framework of the disease in terms of loss, ruin, a death and sentence, a return to childhood, dominant frames used to talk about the disease. Yet, alternative ways and frameworks exist to refer to these illnesses. These alternative frameworks are called counter frames. In the media, these alternative frames are found less frequently, but they do exist. I would like to show some images of some movies, for example, The Old Dancer, a wonderful movie was created thanks to the director Burin Tedeschi. We have several reports about it. In ecclesial discourse, we also have dominant frames for people living with neurodegenerative diseases, who are generally associated with suffering and framed in reference to the cross. Another framework is related to what Pope Francis used. In 2014, when he spoke about the spiritual Alzheimer's, to define the current situation within the Korea with the term a spiritual Alzheimer's, he stigmatized people living with this type of illness. So, all those operating within parishes and hospitals will know that spiritual capabilities of those people will remain long standing. Another dominant frame for speaking about patients is one of the least of these. When we read Matthew 25 in pastoral ministry, sick individuals are commonly associated with one of the least of these as objects of care. In our pastoral work, we often limit ourselves to urging the faithful to visit the sick, feed the hungry, and welcome strangers, because it is by doing this to one of the least of these, who are my brothers, that the faithful welcome the Lord and prepare their entry into the kingdom. Rarely, in pastoral ministry, do we ask ourselves how sick people visit others. Is it imaginable that the Lord does not also call them to care? The stakes are high. Their right to share in the kingdom depends on it. I invite us, therefore, to change our frame and ask ourselves, how do sick people visit other sick individuals, or even visit the general public? I suggest adopting a counter frame. Let us view the elderly and sick person as a disciple with a vocation. This is what the Scottish theologian John Swinton reflected on his book, as you can see in the slide. On his book, Living in the Memories of God, he reflected on this topic. He's a professor of practical theology at Aberdeen, a psychiatric nurse, and also a chaplain to the king. What can the vocation of a believer living with Alzheimer's be? This is the provocative question John Swinton poses to his theology students. Generally, students reply that this is a matter for sick visitation teams. But according to Swinton, this is a category error. He argues that we should view elderly people living with dementia as disciples with a vocation. Pastoral care is certainly important, but discipleship and vocation are essential aspects of the Christian life that we must support throughout the entirety of life. It is amazing to see how this framing completely changes the approach to these individuals. As long as they are viewed as sick and in need, we can content ourselves with visiting and treating them in response to Matthew 25. But if we recognize their status as disciples with a vocation, the goal of our accompaniment changes. Accompanying these individuals is perhaps no longer the sole concern of healthcare ministries, but an activity that all vocational ministries must take into account. How do we discern the vocation and mission of a person living with Alzheimer's disease? To what is God calling them? John Swinton views vocation as a faithful participation in God's work in the world, and every human being has a vocation to respond to God's call. Caring for one another is certainly a fundamental aspect of our vocation, according to the Genesis narrative. And this raises a crucial point. Being a recipient of care, receiving care, is an equally essential aspect of our vocation. One cannot go without the other. Receiving care is neither degrading nor shameful. On the contrary, it is a profound reflection of divine love for vulnerable and dependent human beings. Consequently, depending on the care of others, receiving care, and allowing oneself to be loved means fully participating in God's work in the world. So, when a sick person complains about no longer being of any use, and who deals with the elderly hears that a lot, an answer could be your vocation as a disciple today consists in allowing yourself to be loved, in letting someone care for you, because that is how God shows His love for each of us. Speaking of dependency in terms of vocation and discipleship, provides an empowering counterframe against the objectification of dependent elderly people. But I know very well that it is not that simple. If we want to take the discipleship vocation of the elderly and sick seriously, then we must ensure that they can be spiritually accompanied as well. In what follows, I would like to explore with you how we, as the Church, can spiritually accompany people living with Alzheimer's disease. That's the second point. accompanying sick individuals on the suspension bridge. In Belgium in 2020, a young doctor on psychology, Laura DeWitt, conducted research highlighting that for elderly people living with dementia, numerous sources of well being allow them to give meaning to life. These sources, unsurprisingly, are friendships and family relationships. But more surprisingly, personal growth and a sense of belonging. And as church, the sense of belonging to something. Laura DeWitt shows how a lowered MMSE score at the cognitive level does not necessarily correspond to a loss of meaning in life for sick individuals. She also shows how those around them constantly depreciate and devalue the words of sick patients. Here an example. Mr. Fuchs lives in a nursing institute. I go to him, I visit him, and I ask, "Are you happy?" And he said, "Yes." We have one possibility out of two to have this answer. So I totally agree. But I ask a person suffering from Alzheimer, "What makes you happy?" And he tells me, "My family, my children." This is a relevant answer that I got after the COVID 19 pandemic. So, as I said before, it is relevant. His daughter was there, and do you know what she whispered in my ear? "Don't listen. He doesn't know what he's saying anymore." Is it not tragic to see that in the eyes of society, the words of the elderly people living with neurodegenerative diseases no longer hold any value? Yet, research like that of Laura de Witt emphasizes that it remains possible to experience meaning in one's life even when a person is living with a neurodegenerative disease in an advanced stage. According to her, it is absolutely necessary to continue ensuring the fulfillment of sick individuals. This fulfillment also involves spiritual accompaniment. As the Church, we have a role to play here. But how do we spiritually accompany these individuals? For those of us who are not healthcare professionals, psychologists, or geriatricians, proven methods exist for doing this, and in what follows, I would like to take you with me into my accompaniment of people living with neurodegenerative diseases using the method of spiritual reminiscence. Because actually, echoing Laura de Witt's work on the search for meaning is related to the practice of spiritual reminiscence. This practice falls under reminiscence therapies within care settings. They are used as known pharmacological therapies, similar to art therapy or occupational therapies, memory therapies. I think that it is relevant to take into account the seek of meaning when accompanying the sick, because all these therapy make these people busy from a ludic point of view. But it seems important to me not to dismiss the search of meaning. So these occupational therapy are not valid for anyone. I remember Dr. John preferred the seek of sense. He's a cardiac surgeon who lived in locked unit, and every Wednesday, a volunteer from the Alzheimer's Association would come to play with the residents, and it always began with a little game of lotto. It annoyed him. He said, I don't want to play your foolish game. He was a particular situation, and when I was there, he was willing to discuss my job, and he asked me, "What do you do in theology?" And I said, "I look for God." And he said, "Have you found him?" And I replied, "He's the one who found me." Allowing the search for meaning is an essential task of pastoral ministry. For chaplains in hospitals and institutes, this constitutes a large part of their daily life. For pastoral agents in parishes facing an aging population, the elderly search for meaning should also be one of their concerns. Advanced age often being the time when questions of meaning become more pressing. So I was talking about methods to accompany the search for meaning for people living with neurodegenerative diseases do exist. An Australian researcher had the idea of combining the contributions of reminiscence therapies with the insights of the spiritual care. Her name is Elizabeth MacLean, and she developed a method of spiritual reminiscence. The method has been trialed worldwide. The central insight of the method is that the present is often the only time accessible to the sick person. The methodology explores the present experience of the sick person, which sometimes triggers the emergence of distant memories. Each session is structured around a topic. The short version of the method, which is the one I was able to trial because it is particularly adapted to people in more advanced stages, breaks down into 6 themes: meaning of life, relationships, loneliness, hopes and worries, aging and hoping, faith, friendship, and the church. It may seem surprising to address such deep subjects with disoriented people, but actually, it is often easier for a sick person to answer, "What makes you happy?" than, "What did you eat for lunch today?" And yet, it is this latter question they are asked most often. The method is suitable for small groups discussions, 5 or 6 participants, but it can also be practiced with individuals. The meeting must take place in a safe, pleasant, comfortable location where disoriented people feel at ease. Comfortable chairs, a small side table with flowers, a sign with the theme of the session, and often an icon, as you can see in the slide. Each session lasts between 30 and 45 minutes and is structured the same way. I invite you all to follow me through a spiritual reminiscence session. We have a welcoming time where I introduce myself. I wear a large name tag with my first name. Each person says their name, and I ask each person if I can call them by their first name. Second, I announce or I have someone read the theme of the day, which is posted on the sign. One day, upon hearing that the theme of the day was aging, an elderly lady snapped back, "We don't talk about that," thinking that it was not a common topic to be discussed. I play a song related to the theme, and I usually show some images, not photos anymore, because if we show family photos saying, "Do you remember who that is?" And we know that when a person sees a picture, a family photo, this could be destabilizing. And then we have 2 or 3 questions to structure the exchange. What do you do when you feel lonely? Who are your friends? What are friends for? Sick individuals sometimes take a long time to answer. Sometimes I'm on the third question when someone answers the first. The goal is to get the people talking to each other, not just to me. The objective is to make people talk to one another. In an ecclesial setting, I offer a prayer. We pray for our friends. And don't forget that Pope Francis provided this prayer for sick people and the elderly, which is crucial in the magisterium of fragility. The prayer for the sick is fundamental. Then we sing the same song as at the beginning, and then we say goodbye. Then we share some insights or experiences. And what I find exciting about this method is that it can contribute to maintaining a meaningful relationship with people living with neurodegenerative diseases outside of a therapeutic framework. The goal is not to treat or cure in a medical sense, but to create a bond and allow a search for meaning. It is important not to medicalize a person's entire life. As you can see in the slide, Mrs. K has an MMSC level less than 9. She's very communicative, but her language is riddled with generic words that make a real conversation virtually possible. She's always interested in my jewelry when I get there, which she likes to touch while saying, "That's thingamajig, and it's that too." Mrs. K participates in the discussion group, but when I engage her, she babbles a response that does not always make sense to me. That day, the day I'm going to tell you, I brought the icon of Jesus called Christ and his friends. Mrs. K scrutinizes the icon with rare intensity and said, "I would really like to pray for someone." So we started praying together because that prayer was important. The following week, we addressed loneliness, and Mrs. K remained silent during the discussion. I fear she's not grasping the day's topic, but at the end of the meeting, I asked the participants if they want to add anything. And on that occasion, Mrs. Case raises her hand and says, "I want to say that the solution to solitude is solicitude." Sorry? Okay. So, the solution to solitude is solicitude. So I thank her for this beautiful conclusion, and Mrs. K beams because she understood that she had said something important. I was amazed by the relevance of Mrs. K's remark, and I immediately regret not having recorded the meeting because obviously no one around her believes Mrs. K is still capable of such verbal acuity. So, the goal of spiritual reminiscence is not to provoke these nuggets of life, which doctors call flashes of brilliance. We must be very careful not to create false hopes for family caregivers. Because sometimes loved ones tell me, "Oh, you managed to make them talk." But that's not the case at all. Reminiscence does not cure, it does not bring back speech or memory. The technique allows me to listen, it allows the sick participants a moment together. The clear and almost ritualized structure allow us to feel at ease and to be surprised. Faced with the apparent vacuum of dementia, the spiritual reminiscence method provides a guidebook with a list of topics to address to sustain the relationship. The challenge is to create, for the duration of the encounter, a place of trust and dialogue where all protagonists can unfold and grow in humanity. This double positive action is what I call empowering action. It deconstructs dehumanizing representations to allow the advent of a relationship worthy of the civilization of love so dear to Paul VI, where a culture of life reigns, a culture of care, as Pope Francis stated during the World Day of Peace in 2021. So I personally believe it allows us to step onto a rope bridge to heaven, just to retake the image used by Pope Leo XIV. However, these flashes of brilliance, as with Mrs. K, are not so exceptional. Yet, there still needs to be someone there to gather these words. And that, of course, is where the shoe pinches, because very often the sick person is alone or surrounded by other sick people. So that sick individuals can continue to feel they belong and they are supported by a community of faith, certain Christian communities have initiated the dementia friendly churches dynamic, which is the third point. How can we cross along a bridge to heaven? I'm personally convinced that the church has a role to play in accompanying sick individuals and their loved ones alongside caregivers but outside the care pathway. The dementia friendly churches align with awareness initiatives from various associations across Europe and beyond. These ecclesial communities mobilize around five pillars you can find there: informing the faithful about neurodegenerative diseases and the methods of accompaniment, actively accompanying sick individuals and their loved ones, fostering the participation of sick individuals and their loved ones in the whole life of the community by viewing them as as disciples with a vocation, organizing adapted celebrations while safeguarding Catholic ritual, enab- enabling them to take part in the church's life. And last but not least, working to improve the accessibility of buildings. Parishes working along this pathway reflect not only on what they can do for for sick individuals, but also on how these individuals fund and contribute to growing the community and how they can remain full disciples. I think it is our duty as theologians to provide a theological counterframe, an empowering theology that mobilizes spiritual resources of our faith, allowing us to nourish the hope of sick individuals to remain valued as full member subjects of the community. Sustaining this hope becomes, for me, an act of resistance. Because when our contemporaries understand that one remains a valued and valuable person, perhaps they will stop assuming that it is better to die than to live with Alzheimer's. However, living with Alzheimer's will always remain a journey together in fragility, a journey that will require taking this suspension bridge to heaven. Thank you.